Hey everyone, I just wanted to be in touch with a few comments and synthesizing remarks from the readings for last week. This isn't really a review in the sense that you all seem to kind of get the main ideas from the readings. I'm not going to cover what you've already read and written about on the discussion board, but I do want to talk about a couple sort of bigger picture themes and ideas that I think bring the readings together and make them all a little bit more useful in conjunction with each other. So 5 different things that I want to cover today. I'll try to be as brief as possible. That never happens. Let's start with some sweet little lies. To be clear, I hope you really dislike the sugar industry. I was playing devil's advocate with many of you in the discussion board, trying to nudge you towards thinking about some of the broader issues that Taubes suggests, but unfortunately kind of neglects in his article. So a couple of things. First, notice the power of the rhetorical power of the comparison of the sugar industry to the tobacco industry. Many of you commented on this. As soon as you hear that comparison, that shifts your thinking, that shifts your perspective right away. It's a very, very powerful technique he uses there. Number 2, and more importantly, we have to be aware of this article's own agenda and limitations, however much we might want to agree with it or it kind of resonates with us. What I want to highlight here is how the narrative of the article sets up sugar, on one hand, sugar industry versus truth. And this is a real simple dichotomy. It's very black and white for Taubes. And I want to emphasize that this is more of a rhetorical construction than a real one. Okay, the idea of a simple truth in science over here somewhere being obscured and hidden by greedy corporate interests, sugar industry over here, that's not right. It's a lot more complicated than that. And the problem is that when we think in those overly simplistic terms, or when we write about the sugar industry in those very stark black and white dichotomy kind of way, we're immediately handcuffed to a very limited way of thinking and arguing, right? If the debate becomes, is sugar industry lying to us? Well, we're not going to get to the real issues here. And that's what I want to talk about for a second here. The challenge isn't that the sugar industry is lying and obscuring the truth. That's what we get in Taubes, right? But the real issue is who gets to decide what constitutes danger? What is dangerous? How do you define dangerous or poisonous? How much is too much? When, not if, but when does something like sugar become dangerous for us? Who gets to decide? How do we quantify it? Does it matter if sugar is scientifically proven to be addictive? And how do you prove a threshold of addictiveness? So these are the broader issues that I think Taubes raises, even if he doesn't really recognize them and talk about them explicitly. But I hope you can take away these kinds of questions from this article, because that's where we're getting into this week with our readings and sort of chronic disease with pesticides and GMOs and that kind of thing. Is a little sugar dangerous? No. But at what point do we label it that way and regulate it that way? Those aren't really science questions. Those are policy questions. Those are philosophy. Those are capitalism questions. Those are much bigger than just is it dangerous or not. But like how do we even talk about that? Number 2, all of the articles use a lot of loaded terms, and they'd all be better off if they discussed them more explicitly. But the reason I wanted us to kind of wade through these articles is because it's our job, in this class to become better critical readers and students of the rhetoric of diet and health and figure it out. So especially for Mondays and Wednesdays articles, we see this contrast between real food and fake food, between healthy and unhealthy. Friedman argues that a lot of quote unquote healthy food, smoothies and stuff like that, is just as unhealthy in some metrics, whether it's sugar or fat or whatever, as traditional fast food. And for Philpott, who writes the sort of reply, there seems to be a much clearer distinction between healthy and unhealthy foods, right? I think this distinction is equally fanciful. The point is, neither author really addresses the various ways in which one can make the distinction between healthy or unhealthy, right? And this is why I think they're sort of, talking past each other. They're not even really debating the same thing because they have different assumptions about what processed food is. I mean, what is processed food? How do you really define that? If you buy something that just about everybody would agree is healthy from a fast food place, McDonald's, Burger King, whatever, would it cease to be called processed food, even though you're getting at a place known for processed food? How do we measure what processed food is? And again, who decides? And there seems to be a kind of moral assumption in Philpott's article that processed food is automatically bad. And granted, it's not usually super healthy. But it's way too broad of a category to be used in an argument like Philpott does, or Friedman does. Is sugar a food or a drug? These get regulated very differently, and they're obviously legal distinctions. Also very far from objective ones, right? People make decisions about why something should be called it, what is the threshold for measuring an effect on the body, and so on and so forth. There's no obvious label or criteria for what constitutes healthy, processed, natural, and so on. So if you're using these terms, and both of these articles for Wednesday were using these terms like over and over again, but if you're using these terms without clearly defining them, and not everyone's going to agree, and that's okay, but as somebody who's making an argument about these terms, if you're not getting clear about what these mean, you're going to have people who are just sort of talking past each other, like we saw in these two readings for Wednesday. Number 3, note the role of individual choice. Okay, we've seen this before. Immigrants' diets, New England kitchen. Immigrants are choosing to spend their money incorrectly, uneconomically, inefficiently. Right? They're making poor choices as individuals. Okay, this kind of thinking that we've seen before, and not in very good light, is a popular line of defense for the sugar industry that they've used to say, look, everyone agrees a little sugar is okay. It's healthy. It's necessary. So it's not dangerous. It's fine, right? If someone decides to eat too much, whatever that threshold is, that's their choice. We've seen this kind of argument before, and all of the readings up to Friday, right, which is obviously very different, they don't even consider some of the main questions. A couple of you brought this up in the discussion board, which is very nice. Who are we talking about here? Who eats too much sugar? Who eats too much processed food? Who are we talking about? Why are these people buying so much pre-made food, supposedly unhealthy food in the first place? And part of the assumption that we see in both the Monday and Wednesday readings is that people are rational actors. Okay, it's easy to think that if people just knew more about nutrition, if they knew how much sugar was in their soda and how much they're supposed to be eating, they'd eat less sugar, they'd drink less soda, they'd eat less processed food. We read Taubes in the first week of class. I don't know if you remember this. It's like 10 years ago. The article was something like, why is nutrition so confusing? And he talks about, like we need to do more research. We need to have different studies. We need to invest a lot more in research. But the underlying assumption is that more research, more knowledge is going to make us healthier. We see that in his sugar article that you read on Monday, right? But the history, even the little bit we've done in this class, and really any kind of cultural awareness generally, suggests that this is an overly simplistic view of the world. There's way more to it than choice. The obesity article is great at making the point that obesity is not just about individual choice. And it's so ingrained in our culture and our thinking. I'll talk about that more in a second. But why are people buying cheap food? If you grow up without opportunities for education, or it's devalued in your family or your culture to the point where it's not really an option, where you need to work to support your family, you're just struggling to survive, right? Your ability to learn to think abstractly, the mental flexibility that allows you to sort of do different jobs and excel and kind of, take on different roles, these are going to be limited. This is a fact. Sometimes people end up working 3-4 minimum wage jobs, working all the hours they can just to pay their bills, right? Jobs that many people would refuse to have, right? People are working extremely hard, but trapped in circumstances that it's virtually impossible for anybody to get out of, especially somebody who hasn't had much access or opportunity for education. What are they supposed to do? Can they be criticized for eating cheap, readily available food? What option do they really have? So it's very easy to criticize people for making bad choices, especially with respect to diet, because for most of us, it seems like it's our choice, but it's not always a choice. People too easily equate less affluence with laziness, or fatness with less discipline. The world is not that simple. Number 4, I hope these articles as a set throughout the week call attention to the importance of rhetoric in dietary advice. How do we make arguments? How do these arguments, these articles use evidence? Okay? And what I really want to highlight here, and I think you got a sense of this, science versus not science or not enough science is too simplistic. Industry research versus government versus academic versus whatever, too simplistic. How would the sugar article look if it took as its starting point that science simply can't answer the question about sugar being dangerous? Because there's always going to be competing studies, there's going to be sugar lobbying, there's always going to be some amount of contradictory evidence, right? What if that was the starting point? And it focuses on the question of danger, which I talked about in point 1, right? That's not even mentioned in the article, right? But that's the key issue, isn't it? So a lot of what we've been reading over the last month, really, should encourage us to consider science not as an objective creator of knowledge. This is kind of Taub's assumption, which I think is totally wrong. But we should consider science as a tool that can be used in a lot of ways for a lot of purposes. Scientific community consensus does matter. Absolutely. I want to be very clear. I believe in science. I believe in the scientific community, the scientific method. It has its flaws. It has its biases. It has its problems. But really, it's kind of, in many ways, the best method we have of creating knowledge. And when the scientific community agrees on something, it doesn't have to be completely unanimous, right? It never is going to be, and that's part of science. That's okay. When there's wide consensus, we should take note that this is important. Science can be used in all kinds of ways for policy, even when that's at odds with wide community consensus. And this is potentially dangerous. We've read about the sugar industry on Monday and how it's kind of obscuring the truth, right, deliberately through its own studies and so on. Another thing that it's doing is using scientific disagreement about sugar, in part because it's very hard for, science in an objective way to determine a clear threshold for danger. It's using that disagreement, which is inherent in any field, in any science, in any scientific community, to undermine the fact that there is widespread agreement that there is some threshold, even if we don't know exactly what it is, where sugar becomes detrimental to our health. So that little bit of uncertainty about a particular question that science can't answer very well is used to undermine the general scientific consensus that sugar can, in fact, be dangerous. We see this all the time in lots of fields, and I'd say the most prominent example recently, because we're in the middle of an election cycle here, is climate change. People who deny scientific consensus on climate change are doing the same thing the sugar industry does. They're taking a little bit of disagreement within the community about some aspects and using that to undermine widespread consensus, as much as consensus as you can get in the scientific community, that something like climate change is a real problem, potentially very serious, that we need to address right away. How you use the science of climate change to implement policy, you all have a sense of how complicated and politicized and so on that is. And that is a part of science. Let's go back to fast food and obesity for a second. One student wrote in the discussion board, Philpott did not seem to read Friedman's article for what it is, nor try to understand the importance of some of his points. And this is exactly right. Exactly. All capital letters. Exactly right. Philpott's criticism of Friedman's article in terms of his misguided fat analysis. Friedman is totally wrong about fat and how he describes it. And Philpott's right to point that out. But he kind of ignores the point of Friedman's article, which is to evaluate the role of the fast food industry. Well, you can get a sense that he has kind of a moral repulsion to fast food or the processed food industry. And so what's underlying his response, I think, is an assumption that processed food, fast food, by definition, can't be part of the solution. It is the problem. It just can't be part of the solution, right? And this is a question of rhetoric, not science, right? And this is precisely why I've been pushing you to analyze the rhetorical effect and techniques of diet articles as much as the science and the evidence, right? Again, legitimate scientific research matters, very important, but it's one aspect to how we create the world around us, right? Politics, policies, education, consumerism, capitalism, market economies. Lastly, Barabee, the article for Friday on obesity, is encouraging us to look at external factors that are very hard to research. He probably has the least convincing science of any of the articles we read. He gives lots of references, there's lots of studies. You can tell his article is very well researched, but the science is far more suggestive than definitive. But in a way, that's where its power is, because he's not trying to prove a particular thing through science, but suggesting that we've maybe had some pretty narrow blinders on when thinking about the relationship between diet and health. And for that reason, I think it's actually the most provocative and most useful of the articles we read, because it isn't trying to tell us what is or isn't right or going to happen, but to suggest that maybe we've got to try to enact some systemic change in the way we think about the relationship between diet and health, and not looking so much at macronutrients and micronutrients and calories and so on. And again, individual choice is central to what Barabee is talking about. And one of the ways he's trying to peel back the blinders is to challenge the notion that everyone is fully in charge of their own destiny via their body. This is the American dream, right? We're in the land of opportunity. And if you work hard, you'll have disposable income, you'll be healthier, happier, etc. And this is true for some people, and maybe more people in the US than most, if not all other countries. But it's also an American myth that is part of our historical and cultural identity, the idea that we are fully in charge of our lives, our fates, and so on. The opportunity for self-improvement and socioeconomic movement, those are not distributed equally. And there's no fairness to it. It's luck. There's a lot of luck in having those kinds of chances. And anyone who sacrifices and works hard for success, they're not going to chalk it up to luck and good fortune. They may recognize a fortuitous moment here or there, but they're going to think about all the work and sacrifice they put into getting what they have, getting where they are, and rightfully so. But there's always an element of good luck, even if it's not obvious, right? Because not everyone is afforded a life or circumstances that presents them opportunities or abilities to take advantage, okay? And we see this every day. And Barabee implicitly, I think, is suggesting that our bodies are a reflection of circumstances as much as any individual deliberate choice. So we need to get out of the habit of seeing larger bodies as somehow deviant bodies or immoral bodies or undisciplined bodies, right? There are things that are out of people's control. And he's writing about bodies, about obesity. But I think if you step back, you can see he's really writing about everything. If he's right about all these external factors, if what he's saying is even a little bit true, we have to really change the way we think about diet and health and the way we talk about diet and health. This is exactly what I hope this set of articles throughout the week, last week, encourages you to think about and will inform your work in the class. What kind of discourse do we want about nutrition? When we teach people about science and medicine and nutrition and health and diet in 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade, whenever we learn about it in the curriculum, what are the priorities? What do we really need to teach? Is it understanding how much protein or B12 you need, understanding the difference between good fats and bad fats, understanding how many calories are in certain kinds of foods? Or is it better to teach people how to understand the rhetoric in diet and health, how people make arguments, how evidence is created and used? You can probably guess my own view on that. Okay, that's enough. I'll talk to you later.